sections of the book in which people talk about how they were afraid to talk on the phone and talk about demonstrations because maybe the phones would be tapped. So instead used code in speaking. And nearly everybody said this, that people would say, "Hi Mom, like, has the bread arrived?"
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. Why would a major Jewish organization invite to their gala event a leader of the alt-right and an open friend of neo-Nazis? But that's what the Zionist Organization of America did in New York City, and that's what the Jewish group, If Not Now, protested.
If not now, when? Occupation must end. 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 If not now, when? If not now, when? Occupation must end. If not now, when?
Kind of describe what's going to happen here today.
So we are gathered here, young American Jews from If Not Now, an anti-occupation movement and that fights for freedom and dignity for all. And we are here protesting Steve Bannon's presence at the ZOA.
So tell us about Mr. Bannon. Why you oppose him?
Why do I oppose him? Because he's a hate monger. He's an anti-Semite. He's a white supremacist, and he's an evil human being that doesn't deserve any attention, let alone showing up in New York City in Midtown at a gala with ZOA, being put on some kind of ridiculous, hypocritical pedestal. I despise the guy, basically. It makes me want to, like, vomit.
Now, on The Intercept, they had a headline that said that Bannon likes Israel, but he's made his alt-right, Breitbart vehicle into something the anti-Semites like.
He likes Israel because of all the Jews, but yet he wanted to pull his kids out of school because there were too many Jews there. If he wants to explain that to me, I would gladly, like, sit down and listen. I don't know how you work around that. And then he punched his wife in the face. So on top of being an anti-Semite, he's a wife beater.
Why does ZOA have him on the podium?
Why does ZOA do a lot of things? ZOA is riding a white supremacist line also. I mean, you can't have that kind of hate. You don't need it. There's not enough room for it. There's too many other problems in the world. It's ridiculous already.
What do you think, Mr. Adelson, will also speak?
Apparently, I mean, money talks, and you know what the rest of the saying goes. And I just think that too is deplorable.
See more video of the protest at thestruggle.org, along with our analysis of why a section of the Jewish 1% would be willing to betray Jews. Two weeks ago, we presented Wendy Pearlman reading from her book about Syria, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled. Today, some dialogue between Pearlman and writer and artist Molly Crabapple.
The first thing that I wanted to ask you about is, could you talk about the process of collecting all of these interviews?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I'd be happy to. So, should I sit or stand? I can do either. Maybe I'll stand just so people can see me. So so I began the process in 2012. So my interest began in 2011 when I sort of watching the Arab uprisings from afar. I'd written 2 books about the Palestinian national movement, studying the Middle East for over 20 years. So when the Arab uprisings began, I was captivated as a regional specialist, but probably like all of you or most people on the planet, where it was amazing, these shows of people's power. So I started following in Syria, especially because at that time many Syrians themselves and outside observers said, Syrians are not going to rise up. It's this kingdom of silence was the term used. Syrians are too afraid, the regime is too strong. Protests might go from one country to another in the Middle East, but Syrians are not going to have a revolution. So when Syrians also went out and protested, with such enormous numbers and at such enormous risk, I felt like this was an amazing historic moment. And I wanted to know what it felt like. I wanted to know what motivated people. I wanted to know how it was transforming them. I wanted to know that personal experience of protesting. Because at the time I asked myself, would I have the courage to go out and protest? To risk my life, to know I could be beaten, I could be killed, I could be arrested? And I didn't know how to answer that question. I didn't know how to put myself in the shoes of people who were really risking their lives to go out and say no, to ask for a better system. So I decided I wanted to go and find out what that was like, and that there was no better way than to ask people for their stories. So that was sort of following over the year 2011, and 2012 was the first time that I had to begin sort of collecting these stories. And by that time, I myself was already too afraid to go into Syria to talk to people about protest and politics. So I thought the easiest, safest way for me and others was to talk to Syrians who were leaving the country. And that was sort of the beginning of what's now this epic Syrian refugee outflow. So I began in Jordan in 2012. I began with the names of 2 Jordanian journalists who connected me to a Syrian friend of theirs, who then connected me to other people. And I spent about a month and a half sort of interviewing any displaced Syrian I could in Jordan. The interviews themselves were quite open-ended. Sometimes they were group discussions of several Syrian folks among themselves, sort of chatting and so forth, and I would have an audio recorder and catch the conversation. Sometimes there were these long personal testimonials where I would sit one-on-one with somebody from 20 minutes to 4 hours. Sometimes it continued over days. And I got hooked. The stories were so rich, and they weren't just stories about protest and conflict. They wove into stories about people's entire lives of living under authoritarianism for years or decades before 2011, and then all the details of what 2011 meant to them, and then what happened in their lives leading to the present. So as I got hooked, I knew that I needed to get more numbers and a larger range of Syrians. So I returned to Jordan the next summer, but then also moved on to Turkey, interviewing people who had wound up there. And that just continued for the next 4 years. So from 2012 to 2016, Jordan, Turkey, and then Lebanon, a little sort of side trip to the United Arab Emirates, and then as the large refugee flow went to Europe, continued on to Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, and did some interviews in the United States as well. So I collected and collected. Usually people gave me permission to audio record, which was fantastic, so that I can just sort of be in the moment of hearing someone's story and not have to worry about writing as fast as I could. And also then captured word for word what people were saying, because there's so much beauty in the exact way of expressing, not just the movingness of the stories people told, but the way of telling it. There was so much power in their own words. So I collected then hundreds of thousands of words of transcripts when I slowly got them transcribed and translated so they were on paper, and then became the question of, so what do I do with it? Because when I began, I didn't necessarily know it would be a book or what kind of book. I just thought, this is an historic moment and should be documented from the personal perspective of living these events. And then slowly came to the idea of, through many different drafts with different formats that didn't work as well, so some trial and error, to this format in which my role became a curator. My job was to choose an excerpt, because some of these interviews could be 20,000 words, and the whole book is about 50,000 words. So choosing a portion of an interview, my main job became the cutting, and then putting them in a sequence. And I like to think of it as like making a mosaic, in which each interview is sort of this precious rock, and I had to cut it so that the stone would sort of shine on its own, and then put them together in an order so that the sum was greater than the parts, that it told a joint story, a collective story, as well as each one being an individual story.
I thought you did an amazing job of that. I mean, the succinctness and the poetry of many of these anecdotes, it reminds me of the great Syrian writer Zakaria Tamer, who's known for his ultra short stories that are so full of like black wit and horror and wisdom. One of the things that I often think about when I'm reading about Syrian activists or the Syrian revolution in general, and particularly when I was reading the anecdotes in your book, is a quote by Albert Camus that I'm sure many of us know. Men of my generation had Spain in their hearts. It was there that they learned that one could be right and yet beaten. that force could vanquish spirit, and that there are times when courage is not rewarded. What is it like to read and compile these interviews, at the distance of 6 years now since the start of the Syrian Revolution?
Wow, thank you. It's a really powerful and apt quotation, I think, for this. And one is, I think, as time goes by, maybe people see the force. They see the outcome and forget the courage. I mean, I'll have to see the quotation again in terms of, they see the force and they see the vanquished and maybe forget the earlier moments. I mean, as time goes on, people say the Syrian war, the Syrian civil war, the Syrian refugee crisis. Less and less do we hear the Syrian uprising, the Syrian revolution. So part of what this book tries to do is preserve those memories of a popular uprising against authoritarianism, a popular call of ordinary people risking everything, sacrificing everything for freedom, for dignity, and then also put that uprising in its historical context. What exactly was the nature of the system that people were rising up against? So I hope it tells that a larger history that's always there, but in the sort of rush of everyday events, the rapid fire pictures of rubble and destruction and dead bodies and so forth, forget some of the earlier moments. So as I was saying, it begins with these stories of what life was like under Assad's authoritarian rule. Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, and the people's memories of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, about silence, about intimidation, about security force rule, about a sense of having no accountability for abuses committed by those who were in power, a sense of futility, how will this regime ever change, what can be done, of corruption, endemic, systematic corruption, that those who had power were able to also have money and abuse it infinitely, and those who didn't, as is the opening line of the book, a drama student who says, a Syrian citizen is a number, dreaming is not allowed. So it paints a picture of this kind of world where many felt like, it's impossible to dream, what are you going to dream of? And then moves to these sections about the revolution, and it is like daring to dream. These small, tentative demonstrations, the way people begin watching events in Tunisia and Egypt, wondering will it happen here, slowly sort of pushing the boundaries to dream bigger and bigger, and then, as sort of alluded to in the parts I read, what it felt like and what it meant to people to go out and protest for the first time. People who maybe never even imagined that there could be mass protests, what a demonstration was like. And that was, for me, my most favorite part of the interviews I did, was to ask people, what was your first demonstration like? And people, I had 60-year-old men with tears coming down their eyes, and you could see on a human level, imagining what it is like to go out and say no. And people would say things like, my first protest was like the first time I breathed, or the first time I said no, or the first time I felt like a real dignified human being. To claim that. That is what this revolution meant to those who supported it, who participated in it, who championed it. And then the regime responded to peaceful protests with violence. The opposition took up arms. It escalated to the horrible war and all the consequences we see today. And in that memory of the courage, the euphoria, the togetherness is increasingly buried. And I think that's a crime to those who went out. It's not just totally false and historic amnesia and a wrong way to know history and understand what's happened, but it is a dishonor to those who risked so much for such really true ideals.
Your first two books, Occupied Voices and Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, are both about Palestinian resistance.
Yeah.
How did studying Palestine for so many years affect how you approached Syria?
Great, thank you. So my first book, I began studying the Middle East during a college semester abroad in Morocco, and then continued on, and eventually, Morocco was kind of the center of my world. Some of my college friends here might remember. And then I gradually was like, oh, the real action happens eastward. So I wound my way to Palestine, and I spent a semester there and got totally sort of hooked on the Palestinians from January to June 2000, I was in the West Bank, and then I continued going back for like the next 10 years or so. So I began my first book, Occupied Voices, sort of at the beginning. I just started my PhD studies, and it's also a book of interviews. So I think that Palestine probably taught me something, but also I early on got hooked on interviews and collecting personal stories as a really, really valuable way to understand politics. I mean, we all hear about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all the time on the news. It's a constant source of news and events, and it's difficult, I think, for your average reader and news follower to even keep straight who the actors are and what's happened in the history and so forth. But having spent time there living with people and having colleagues and classmates and housemates and so forth who were Palestinian, I found there was something really special I learned about the experience of being Palestinian and the whole Arab-Israeli conflict by people's stories, their everyday life of how you get from one place to another and whether there's water or electricity, and the memories of interactions with soldiers or family stories. And in everyday lives, you could see the impact of politics, the impact of conflict and of war, the impact of a struggle and what it meant to people. So early on, I got a sense of personal stories as a way that not only showed sort of what was at stake in these conflicts, but also even a way of understanding what they're all about. So my first book was a book of interviews with Palestinians. The second one was a revision of my dissertation, so it's much more sort of heavy and academic. But I think then, as the Syrian conflict began, I returned to that kind of roots of personal stories can show something about conflict that can help us understand, but also know why it matters. But otherwise, I think that I've had this long sort of interest, I think probably from my studies of the Palestinians, of protest, of social movements, of an understanding of how difficult it is to get collective action off the ground, of how difficult it is to unify a struggle, what it means to be up against a foe who is in many ways more powerful, the resilience over years or generations maybe that it takes to continue struggling for goals when they're not achieved. One maybe sadder thing is that a huge aspect of the Palestinian reality is being a refugee diaspora. When I began studying the Syrian conflict, I never thought about it in refugee terms. And I started interviewing Syrian refugees, not because they were refugees, but because they were Syrians. And many of them expected to go home at any moment in 2012. People had their bags packed or didn't even have bags. I remember having interviews with these young guys who were like, I don't think I'm going to buy a can opener here in Turkey because I have a can opener back home and I'm not going to be here for very long. It was that sense of any day we're going to go back. And over the years I've watched many of those displaced almost like I come to like being a refugee is a process more than an event. Slowly begin to feel like maybe they're not going home anytime soon. There's still that dream, but life goes on. So I didn't begin my study of Syria thinking that my contact with Palestinian refugees might give me insight into Syria, but I think increasingly now there's a refugee dimension which is of salience independent of the issue of the conflict and the uprising itself. So there are lots of parallels and things to dig in there, I think, for insight and for understanding.
Right now, there is a concerted effort to erase a lot of the origins of the Syrian war, to erase a lot of crimes done by the Syrian government, and to erase a lot of the activity that you were speaking of, the revolutionary activity. There's a state-funded effort to pretend that the Syrian revolution never existed, that the people protesting the government were always members of Al-Qaeda, were always terrorists. And by the same token, there's also a fatigue that sets in when people in the West see so much death and where they want to forget about it and turn their eyes away and certainly not look at protests or not look at people's courage, to just say, oh, this is dead bodies, this is dead children, and that's it, and then look away. How do you feel this book that is people's personal stories can counteract those two narratives?
Wow. Yeah, 'cause it brings back to the nuts and bolts. So I love the stories that really talk about how the uprising got off the ground. That if now there's a sense of the terrorist gangs or West. I mean, I had a talk yesterday in which a student said, "So was the CIA really there funding demonstrations from the beginning? How do you know?" So yeah, I sense of in any way this kind of revisionism of it was Islamic extremists from the beginning, or Al-Qaeda from the beginning, or outside interveners from the beginning, and not a genuine grassroots uprising. But the stories that people told about how they first came to participate in protests, or how those protests got off the ground, are so grassroots. I mean, when people walked me through the nuts and bolts of the decision, hour by hour, day by day, it was almost a miracle that demonstrations got off the ground. I mean, I remember some young people telling me, like for every demonstration that succeeded, there were 500 that failed. And there are stories about someone hearing, a demonstration is supposed to start at one mosque, and he went to that mosque, and he stood up and said, something to get the protest going, and everyone looks at him like, no, it's the other mosque. I mean, and so he kind of walks away. He's like, Allahu Akbar, and people are like, and he sort of slinks away. And there's a story of someone tells a story of someone who went from a protest and people are singing and chanting and singing and dancing, and he locks arms on the right with someone and locks arms on the left, and they're walking along, and then those two people slowly guide him to a police car because they're undercover agents who were there, and then he went off to be arrested. There's another person who was arrested by the secret police, and they said, "You were in demonstrations," and he was like, "I was not in demonstrations, I swear," and they show him a video of him at a demonstration, and he's singing and chanting, and he's on the shoulders of someone who turns out to be the interrogator, who's like, "Oh, you weren't there?" So, I mean, there was that littered with danger. People talk, and then another person who was a media activist himself filming videos of demonstrations, because there was either this sort of rhetoric of the demonstrations are all terrorist gangs, or they're not happening at all. So people also risked their lives to film them, to document them, to show that they were real, to smuggle that film coverage out to satellite television channels so it would circulate and so forth. And one of the media activists who was in charge of, or his town was doing a lot of the filming, that even the other demonstrators were fearful that maybe he was filming because he was working for the secret police. So he said he always went to the back of the demonstration, so you only got people's from the back of their heads and didn't get faces, but could you still get some sense of the crowd. So you see that the sheer ingenuity that it took. I mean, there's sections of the book in which people talk about how they were afraid to talk on the phone and talk about demonstrations because maybe the phones would be tapped. So instead used code and speaking, and nearly everybody said this, that people would say, "Hi Mom, like, has the bread arrived? Are you having a party? Is it foggy? This entire and those of you who were there remember, like, is it foggy? Is it raining? Has the party started?" I mean, people used code to say, like, demonstrations, has the security forces arrived, is there shooting, and so forth. Like, that was the level of care. And then once there were real reprisals and there were curfews and cities were sealed off, how people worked together to smuggle in bread or smuggle in medicine or help each other and neighbors and so forth. So much tremendous and truly grassroots work on the individual level, the level of the apartment, the neighborhood, and so forth. What it took to get this off the ground. There's another great story. I don't think it actually made it into the book of when there was a call on Facebook for the revolution to begin on March 15th. That everyone should have demonstrations on March 15th, and people in the sort of the southern town of Dera, where ultimately there were mass protests that were really critical, talked about how they were going to have a protest on March 15th, and people talked that they should have a demonstration outside the courthouse. And one man said, that was the idea. So we walked to the courthouse and find the plaza outside the courthouse just filled with police officers. Somehow had gotten word. And he said, we walked by and we didn't even stop. We just walked to the courthouse and just went walking on our way as if we were just on a walk to go to the grocery store. And then 3 days later, there happened to be a mass demonstration there, which still was so contingent, could have been stopped or blocked or derailed on so many levels. So people worked so hard, pulled together their resources, and had such sheer level of courage to make this happen, to now look back and say, oh, it was a CIA plot. It was funded or fomented from the outside. that it had some sort of radical agendas is just such a, thank you for being here, such a complete misunderstanding. It's slanderous, of history. So that is just, and when you get those personal stories, you see that contingency, that hesitation, that miracleness of it, that blows any sort of larger conspiracy theory just out of the water. It's totally out of sync.
How are your friends and sources doing now?
Yeah, thanks. It's the whole variety. So for the thanks to Facebook, I'm still in touch with as many people as I can be. There were some people with whom I had very brief encounters. I never even got their real name, and I can only wonder how and where they are now. But for many, many people, I'm still in touch. And one thing that's been interesting is that people have not only, they're Syrians whose lives are intimately intertwined with the Syrian conflict and living the conflict, and the conflict is their life and their life is the conflict. But people have also had the regular life cycle of being people. That there are I met a lot of interviews with young guys sort of in their mid-20s or early 20s, activists who lived and breathed revolution for several years, and I met them in 2012 or 2013. As I got to know them over the years, many of these guys said, I want to get married. I want to have kids. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, you're a human being too. You're not just a revolution machine. And now many of them are married, and some of them have children, and maybe some have moved from Turkey and Lebanon to Sweden and Germany, and they're learning new languages, and they're providing for their kids. And a very large part of their heart is still in Syria, and they're still checking the news continually, and they're worried about their families who are there, or their families who are scattered, or the family members who've been arrested and disappeared. But they also have moved on to different stages of their life. So that's been a real joy for me, is to watch people move on to a different stage of their lives, especially that sort of the young cohort that are now becoming parents of their own and have new aspirations and new and in many ways new sources of joy.
I asked Pearlman about Palestinian refugees in Syria who are now refugees from Syria, and I asked Crabtree about her work around Syria.
As I talked to many, I found it very interesting talking to many Palestinians from Syria. Many said things like, I didn't realize how Syrian I was until the revolution began. Like, the revolution taught me that I was Syrian. I'd always identified as Palestinian, but maybe we haven't been in Palestine for several generations. When this began, I realized it was my struggle too. So I think there's an interesting thing of how Palestinian Syrian identity that has changed over time and evolved over time, and people discover their own identity on the backdrop of these tumultuous events. And I think that's the case, probably still evolving for Palestinians from Syria. So I'll now happily pass this over to Molly.
Thank you. So I've been covering Syrian refugee issues and the Syrian war since 2013. My first piece was for the New York Times in Tripoli, which is a city in North Lebanon that has been embroiled in a sort of sectarian neighborhood versus neighborhood war for the last 40 years, and that now is taking a huge number of Syrian refugees who are finding themselves on a new front line. I also covered Syrian refugees in Turkey, in Kurdish areas of Iraq, inside Syria at the border camp Baba Salem, and in refugee camps in Greece, which were by far the worst refugee camps that I saw anywhere, wow. despite getting $800 million to make them nice. I am currently working on a book with an amazing Syrian journalist, Marwan Hisham, who decided to stay in Raqqa when ISIS invaded his hometown and reported undercover for places like the New York Times and Foreign Policy. It's his memoir of the Syrian Revolution and War, and I did about 82 illustrations for that, and we wrote it together. I also, for some years, I've done murals for the Karam Foundation, which is an amazing Syrian-American run aid group. I recently covered the library of their building in giant portraits of people like Darwish and Mohammed al-Mahmoud and Nizar Kabani. I guess that's my resume. Writing about Syria.
Yeah.
And I think what drew me to it was perhaps something similar to what drew you to it, which was an admiration for the extraordinary courage, despite all odds, of people facing impossible repression.
Promoting Enduring Peace is sponsoring a talk by the renowned Yale professor Timothy Snyder. After the presidential election, a Facebook post by Snyder calling for resistance to tyranny went viral. Last week, 60,000 fascists in Poland marched in the streets, making Snyder's insights all the more timely. Snyder's talk is free and open to the public Tuesday evening, November 28th in New Haven, Connecticut. Come early to get a seat. And if you're viewing this before Sunday, the 19th of November, consider going to the Unity March for Puerto Rico, 10 to 3 p.m. at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.